The first time I saw the resort, I thought it was the most beautiful place I had ever been in my life. Terraced gardens tumbling down toward the Pacific, white stone archways draped in bougainvillea, and the kind of quiet that money buys and ordinary people only dream about. I was 29 years old, standing at the service entrance with a name tag that read Sarah and a cart full of fresh linens, and I remember thinking that my husband would have loved it here. My husband, Marcus, who had been gone for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. I need to go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. Marcus and I met during our residency orientation at Cedars-Sinai. He was the one who laughed too loudly at the department head's jokes, not to be charming, just because he genuinely found them funny. I noticed that first. The absence of performance. He had nothing to prove to anyone, and in a room full of overachieving, sleep-deprived young doctors all desperately trying to impress each other, that quality felt almost startling. I introduced myself between sessions, and he shook my hand and said, "Sarah Chen. You were top of your class at Hopkins. I read your paper on post-operative pain management. It was really good." He said it the way someone might say, "The weather is nice." Not flattery, just fact. I married him 3 years later in a small ceremony in Pasadena. His parents came from Portland. My mother flew in from Sacramento and cried through the entire reception. We danced to a song we had picked because it made us both laugh, not because it was romantic, and somehow that made it more romantic than anything else could have been. Marcus pressed his cheek against my temple and whispered, "We did it. We actually did it." Like he still couldn't believe we were real. Our life together was not glamorous. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Silver Lake with a kitchen too small to cook in properly and a neighbor who played guitar at 11 every night. We worked brutal hours. We passed each other in hallways and left notes on the refrigerator and fell asleep mid-sentence on the couch. But when we were together, really together, with nowhere to be and no pager buzzing between us, the world felt entirely sufficient. He had this way of listening. Full and unhurried. Like whatever I was saying was the only thing happening in the universe. He was a cardiothoracic surgeon, gifted in a way that made other surgeons quiet when his name came up, but he wore it lightly. Patients adored him, not because he was brilliant, though he was, but because he sat with them before procedures and held their hands, and never made them feel like a problem to be solved. About 8 months before he disappeared, something shifted. I noticed it in small ways at first. The way he sometimes went quiet in the middle of a sentence, like a thought had pulled him somewhere I couldn't follow. The way he started double-checking the locks at night, something he had never done before. I asked him once, gently, if everything was all right at work. He gave me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and said he was just tired. Busy season. You know how it is. I did know, so I let it go. The last normal evening we had together was a Tuesday. I had made pasta, which was about the full extent of my cooking ambition, and we sat at the kitchen table with the balcony door open and talked about taking a trip to Portugal. Marcus had pulled up flights on his laptop and was showing me prices, and for an hour, the tension I had sensed in him for months seemed to dissolve completely. He was laughing. He was present. He reached across the table and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear and said, "I just need to get through this next week. 1 more week, and then we breathe." I asked him what was happening that week. He said it was a complicated case, a patient he had concerns about. He'd explain everything once it was resolved. I nodded. I trusted him. I always trusted him. He left for the hospital the next morning before I was awake. That was normal. I rolled over and found the warm spot where he had been sleeping and fell back into a doze, and when I woke up properly he was already gone. I texted him around noon. He replied with a single heart emoji, which was his shorthand for "I'm in surgery, I'm okay, I'll call later." He never called. By 7 that evening, I had called the hospital. They told me, "Doctor, Marcus Webb had finished his shift at 4 and signed out." His car was still in the parking structure. His phone went to voicemail. By 9, I had called the police. By midnight, his parents were on the phone with me, his mother's voice breaking in a way I had never heard before. By morning, he was officially listed as a missing person. And my life had cracked cleanly down the middle into the time before and the time after. The investigation that followed was thorough, at least at first. Detectives reviewed security footage from the hospital parking structure. They found Marcus walking to his car at 4:17 inches the afternoon, briefcase in hand. He reached the car. And then, at the edge of the frame, where the camera angle ended and shadow began, he simply stopped. A black SUV with no visible plates was parked 2 spaces down. The footage from that angle was conveniently degraded, a malfunction the techs couldn't fully explain. After that, nothing. No trace. No witnesses. No body. The detectives told me gently that adults have the right to disappear. One of them, an older man with tired eyes, sat across from me in my own kitchen and spoke to me in the careful tone people use with children or with the very fragile. He wasn't unkind, but I could see in his face that without evidence of a crime, their resources would eventually be redirected. I did not redirect. I could not. I hired a private investigator named Gail Okafor, a former LAPD detective who had left the force to work cases that the system had quietly shelved. She was methodical and honest with me in a way I needed more than comfort. She told me on our first meeting, "I may find answers you don't want. Are you prepared for that?" I told her yes, because the not knowing was already worse than anything I could imagine. Gail found the edges of something within the first 2 months. Marcus had been treating a patient named Raymond Holt, a man whose name carried the kind of weight that opens doors and closes mouths. Tech billionaire. Major donor to the hospital. The kind of patient who gets a private floor and a dedicated care team. Marcus had discovered something during that treatment, a pre-existing condition that Holt had concealed from his business partners and from his board of directors. Something that would have had significant consequences for an ongoing merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Marcus had flagged it internally. He had spoken to the hospital's chief of medicine. And then, 11 days later, he had vanished. Gail laid it out for me at my kitchen table, the same table where Marcus and I had talked about Portugal. She didn't speculate beyond the evidence. But she didn't need to. I lived in the suspension of that knowledge for over a year. Working. Functioning. Moving through days that felt like walking through water. I had taken a leave of absence from my own residency program in the early months, when I was too fractured to safely care for patients. Eventually I returned, part-time at first, then full. My attending told me that working was the bravest thing I could do. I didn't feel brave. I felt like I was running out of ways to stay still. Money had become a problem. Marcus and I had been paying down medical school debt, and the mortgage on the apartment, and the private investigator, and all the costs that grief quietly accumulates. I started picking up additional shifts wherever I could. A former colleague mentioned that a resort up the coast was looking for medical staff for their exclusive wellness programs, luxury clients. Excellent pay. Discretion required. I took the position. The Halcyon Bluff Resort was the kind of place that existed in a different register than the rest of the world. Nestled on a stretch of the California coast between Malibu and Santa Barbara, it catered to an extremely private clientele. Tech executives, old money families, international dignitaries. I was hired as part of a small wellness team, administering IV hydration therapies and monitoring guests with ongoing health concerns. The work was not glamorous, medically speaking, but it was quiet, and the pay covered 3 months of investigator fees in a single paycheck. I had been there for 6 weeks when it happened. It was a Thursday morning in late October, overcast and cool, the sea, the color of pewter. I was setting up a treatment room in the wellness pavilion, arranging equipment with the particular focused calm that routine had taught me. The pavilion was at the far end of the property, connected to the main residence by a covered walkway lined with jasmine. I heard footsteps on the walkway. 2 sets. A woman's voice, clipped and authoritative, giving instructions about a schedule change. And then another voice, responding. Male. Low and measured and careful. My hands stopped moving. I know that voice the way I know my own heartbeat. I have heard it across 100 hospital corridors, across a kitchen table, in the dark of a bedroom at 2 in the morning. I would know it in a crowd of thousands. I would know it stripped of everything except sound. I set down what I was holding and walked to the doorway. He came into view through the glass panels of the walkway, walking half a step behind a woman I recognized as Claudia Marsh, the resort's head of private guest services. He was dressed differently than I had ever seen him: slim trousers, a linen shirt, no tie, the kind of deliberate casualness that money teaches. His hair was longer. There was a scar along his jaw that had not been there before. He was thinner. But it was him, Marcus. My husband. He turned his head, and for one suspended second, our eyes met through the glass. I felt the air leave my body. I gripped the doorframe. His expression did not change. There was no flicker of recognition, no intake of breath, no sudden stillness. He simply looked at me the way a person looks at a stranger, politely, briefly, and then looked away. Claudia said something to him, and he nodded, and they continued down the walkway and out of sight. I stood in the doorway of the treatment room for a long time afterward. My colleague found me there and asked if I was all right. I told her I needed a moment. She brought me water and left me alone, and I sat in a chair and pressed my hands flat on my thighs and breathed and tried to determine whether I was losing my mind. I was not losing my mind. That evening, I called Gail from my car in the resort parking lot, speaking quietly with the windows up. I told her everything. The voice, the walk, the scar. The way he was dressed. She listened without interrupting. And when I finished, she said, "Don't do anything yet. Give me 48 hours. She came back in 36. The man serving as the resident private physician at Halcyon Bluff had been hired 14 months ago under the name Dr. Daniel Reeves. His credentials were impeccable on paper. Board certified in internal medicine, references from 2 private practices in Arizona, a spotless record. Gail pulled the thread. The Arizona practices had no memory of him. The medical school, listed on his CV, had no record of a Daniel Reeves graduating in the year stated. The Social Security number attached to his employment file had been issued to a different person who had died in 1987. Daniel Reeves did not exist. But the physical description matched Marcus Webb precisely. Height, build, blood type listed on the resort's internal health records, even a notation about a surgical scar on his right forearm from a procedure Marcus had as a teenager. Gail also found something else. Claudia Marsh, the woman I had seen him with, was not simply a resort employee. She was a partial owner of the Halcyon Bluff property through a series of holding companies. One of those holding companies shared a registered agent with a firm that had received a substantial wire transfer from Raymond Holt's personal accounts 6 weeks after Marcus disappeared. I sat with that information overnight. I did not sleep. I made a list of what I knew and what I could prove, and I called Gail in the morning and told her I was ready to go to the police. We went together. Gail had contacts in the FBI field office in Los Angeles, people who had been watching Raymond Holt's financial activities for reasons unrelated to Marcus. When we laid out what we had, the agent across the table went very still in the way that people go still when something clicks into place. He made a phone call. Within 2 hours, the conversation had expanded to include a federal prosecutor. The next days were agonizing in a different way than any days before. I had to continue reporting to the resort. I had to see Marcus in hallways and at staff meetings and in the wellness pavilion where he occasionally consulted on guest cases, and I had to behave as though he were a stranger, because that was what the investigators required. Every time he glanced at me with that polite, absent expression, I felt something tear quietly inside me. On the 4th day, I broke protocol. It was early morning, before the other staff arrived, and I found him alone on the lower terrace overlooking the water, standing with a coffee cup and looking at the horizon with an expression I recognized. He used to stand like that on our balcony in Silver Lake. Not thinking about anything particular, just being in a place. I walked up beside him and said his name. His real name. Marcus. He turned. That polite, neutral look. Then something else. A shadow crossing his face, barely perceptible, but I had spent years learning to read him. "I don't know that name," he said quietly. "I know," I said, "but I do. My name is Sarah. I'm a nurse who works in your wellness pavilion, and before that I was your wife. We lived in Silver Lake. We had a neighbor who played guitar every night at 11. You made me coffee every morning even though you left before I woke up, and you always left it in the thermos because you knew I wouldn't get to it until it was cold. He was very still. You have a scar on your right forearm, I said. You fell off your bike when you were 14. Your mother still teases you about it. Something shifted in his face, not recognition, not yet, but disturbance, like a surface disturbed by something beneath it. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice was careful and controlled in a way that didn't sound like him at all. I don't know what you're talking about. He walked away. But his hands, holding the coffee cup, were trembling. The FBI moved the following morning. They arrived at the resort before breakfast with a warrant that covered Claudia Marsh and 2 other individuals named in the investigation. The agents who came for Marcus, for the man they had in their records as Daniel Reeves, were gentle. They had been briefed. They knew they were dealing with a person who had potentially been held under false identity through psychological and pharmaceutical means. Because that is what Gail and the federal investigators had pieced together. Marcus had not simply been kidnapped and given a new name. In the weeks after his disappearance, he had been held at a private medical facility outside Tucson, one that Holt had financial ties to. The doctors there had treated what they recorded as a dissociative episode following psychological trauma. The treatment, which included medications now flagged by the FBI's medical consultant, had not caused true amnesia. It had done something arguably more deliberate. It had suppressed, blurred the edges, made his memories of his previous life feel distant and unreal, like something he had dreamed rather than lived. Then Claudia Marsh had stepped in. She had offered him stability, a name, a role, a life that felt coherent. He hadn't been brainwashed in the cinematic sense. He had been carefully, methodically unmade and rebuilt. At Massachusetts General, in the video that inspired this story, the trigger was a parking garage. For Marcus, the investigators allowed me to be present when they brought him to a consultation room and showed him his own medical license, his hospital ID, photographs of his parents. He sat across the table from a forensic psychologist and looked at the photographs for a long time. I was in the room. I sat across from him and I did not say anything. I just let him look. He picked up the photograph of our wedding. We had taken it in the garden of the venue, late in the afternoon when the light was going gold and neither of us had known the photographer was still shooting. We were not looking at the camera. We were looking at each other, laughing at something, and his hand was on the back of my neck and I was leaning into him, like he was a wall I had chosen to trust. He looked at that photograph for a very long time. Then he put it down, very carefully, and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, and a sound came out of him that I will never be able to describe accurately. Not a word. Something older than words. The psychologist asked him gently what he was feeling. I remember her, he said. His voice was raw. I remember her. I couldn't, and now I can, and I don't understand what happened to me. He looked up, he looked at me. I had been holding myself very carefully together for 2 years, 3 months, and some number of days. I stopped doing that. We were both crying before either of us moved. He reached across the table and took my hand and held it the way he had at the altar in Pasadena, and I felt the shape of his fingers, which I had memorized without meaning to, and the world reorganized itself around that point of contact. The legal process that followed was long and, at times, brutal. Raymond Holt's attorneys were expensive and aggressive. He maintained that he had no knowledge of any plan to harm Marcus Webb, that he had simply arranged for a disturbed employee to receive appropriate psychiatric care through a facility he happened to fund. The wire transfers, his team argued, were unrelated. Coincidental. The federal prosecutor did not find them coincidental. The facility outside Tucson surrendered records under subpoena. 3 physicians who had treated Marcus lost their licenses. The registered agent connecting Claudia Marsh's holding company to Holt's personal accounts was found to be an associate of Holt's personal attorney. It took 14 months from the morning of the arrests to the day the jury returned its verdict, and during those 14 months, Marcus and I sat in a federal courthouse more times than I can count, And I watched my husband reclaim himself piece by piece in front of people who had tried to erase him. Holt was convicted on charges including conspiracy to commit kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and wire fraud. He received a sentence that will keep him incarcerated past the age at which any of this will matter to him anymore. Claudia Marsh accepted a plea agreement in exchange for her testimony. She served time, though less than I believed she deserved. The physicians who administered the suppression protocols faced separate proceedings through the state medical board and through civil court. I was not present for all of the sentencing hearings. There were days I needed to be somewhere else, somewhere without cameras or attorneys or the controlled theater of consequences. On one of those days, Marcus and I drove up the coast, past Halcyon Bluff and beyond it, to a stretch of beach with no resort and no history attached to it, and we sat on the sand and watched the water and didn't talk about any of it for a few hours. He told me that the hardest part, looking back, was the sensation he'd had during those months at the resort. A persistent, low-grade wrongness, like a note played slightly flat that you can't quite identify but can't stop hearing. He had attributed it to what Claudia told him was a history of depression. He had pushed it down. He had built a life over the top of it, the way you build over uncertain ground without testing it first. He said he had dreamed about coffee in a thermos and never known why. We were not the same people who had danced at our wedding in Pasadena. We did not expect to be. We went back into couples therapy, which we had started in the months before he fully recovered his memories, and our therapist was honest with us in the way good therapists are. She said that reintegrating after an experience like his was not linear and not quick. She said there would be weeks that felt like backsliding. She said that trust, even between two people who loved each other, had to be rebuilt when it had been disrupted, even by forces outside either person's control. We did the work. We kept doing the work. We moved out of the Silver Lake apartment eventually. Too many ordinary memories had become sharp objects in there. We found a place in Pasadena, close enough to the garden where we had been married that we could walk past it on Sunday mornings. Marcus returned to medicine slowly, in a limited consulting capacity at first, and then more fully as his confidence rebuilt itself. I finished my residency. We got a dog, a large, opinionated rescue named Biscuit who destroyed exactly one couch and then settled into decency. Small things. The kind of small things that are only small until you nearly lose them. I think about Claudia Marsh sometimes. Not often, and not with softness exactly, but with the complicated regard you develop for someone whose choices shaped years of your life. She was not the architect of what happened to Marcus. She was an opportunist who received a broken man and chose to keep him rather than return him. I understand, in some abstract way, that she may have genuinely believed she was giving him something. A clean start. A peaceful life. She did not ask whether the peace was real or simply installed. Raymond Holt I do not think about with complexity. He made a calculation. He decided that my husband's silence was worth more to him than my husband's freedom, or his memory, or his life. He was wrong, and eventually the law agreed. What I return to, when I return to any of it, is that Tuesday evening in our kitchen, the pasta going cold. Marcus showing me flights to Portugal on his laptop, laughing, saying one more week and then we breathe. I did not know it was the last ordinary evening we would have for years. I did not know that the weeks stretching ahead of us would be nothing like what either of us imagined. But I also returned to a different moment. A federal consultation room. A photograph of two people in a garden at golden hour, laughing at something neither of them remembered anymore. My husband's hands pressed against his eyes. And then his voice, rough and certain and undeniable, I remember her. That is the sentence I carry. When the work is hard, when the grief resurfaces in forms neither of us expected, when Biscuit destroys something and I'm laughing too hard to be appropriately angry, when Marcus makes coffee in the morning and still, to this day, leaves it in the thermos because he knows I won't get to it until it's cold. I remember her. As if the 2 years and the suppression and the careful, deliberate erasure of everything we had built together had not been able to reach the deepest part of him. As if somewhere below memory, below name and language, and the constructed identity they had placed over him like a mask, something had kept its shape. Had waited. Love does not promise you safety. It does not promise that the people you choose will not be taken from you by forces that care nothing about what you have built. It does not promise legibility or fairness or a timeline that makes sense. What it promises, I think, is this: that it holds on even when nothing else does. That it leaves a shape in the dark that can still be found, if someone keeps looking. If someone refuses to believe that gone means gone. I kept looking. He came back. We are still, every single day, finding our way back to each other. And I think we will be doing that for the rest of our lives. I think that is not a tragedy. I think that might be exactly what love is.